Hello, good evening. Welcome everybody to our annual IFSTAL public lecture. This is the third public lecture that we're running at IFSTAL, and I'm Lauren Blake and I'm the coordinator at IFSTAL in LCIRAH, which comprises SOAS, where we are here this evening, London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine and the Royal Veterinary College. So I'm also welcoming our many colleagues across our consortium. So we're live streaming this event to our consortium in Oxford, Reading and Warwick, where they're having local events, and they'll be joining us for the lecture part, and then we'll be saying goodbye to them and they'll be getting on with their own activities and receptions and so on, whilst we have a bit of discussion, and then we'll be having some drinks just out here as well afterwards. So I just wanted to welcome all of the live stream people as well. It's great because we've got a whole mix of people, predominantly our wonderful IFSTAL students, but also some of our IFSTAL alumni from previous years, some of our colleagues across other institutions and sort of various friends of the programme. So it's really nice to have that brilliant mix here. Toilets are just out here on the left, and there's no planned fire escape, so I guess run out the way we came in if anything happens. I think that's everything for now. So the format is that we have Jeff, who's going to be chairing the evening, and then Judith will give her talk, followed by some questions afterwards. So, and just a final reminder as well for our IFSTAL students that our workshop, which is our next workshop, Workshop 2, is happening on Saturday the 19th of January. That's taking place in Reading, and applications for that close this Monday. And we've also got some continuing professional development courses which are completely new, and they're being led by City University, and that's launching early 2019. So if you're interested in that, or you know anyone who might be, then please do send them that way. And with, I think those are all the notifications, so I'm going to introduce Jeff. So Jeff Waage is an agricultural scientist by training with a career in international agriculture and environmental development in universities and international organisations. He's managed interdisciplinary research programmes in UK universities for many years, most recently at the London International Development Centre and the Leverhulme Centre for Integrative Research on Agriculture and Health, what we refer to as LCIRAH, which he chairs presently. He also provides support to a number of ongoing LCIRAH-linked programmes, in particular the Improving Human Health Programme of CGIAR, Agriculture for Nutrition and Health. And he's done lots of technical advising for the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition as well. So, Jeff, I will welcome you up onto the stage to chair this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, and good evening, everyone. It's nice to be here. Again, actually, I remember we've had many good years of LCIRAH meetings in this room over the past. It's a particular pleasure for me tonight to be able to introduce as our presenter of the IFSTAL public lecture this year, Dr. Judith Batchelar. Judith comes to this event with a distinguished career of over 35 years in the food and drink industry. She's a biochemist and a registered nutritionist, and has held prominent roles in food manufacturing with Safeways, Marks and Spencer's, and Mars, and most recently with Sainsbury's, where she is the director of the Sainsbury brand, which seems to encompass a great deal, all the way from being responsible for aspects of Sainsbury's product offer, policy and ethical and sustainable sourcing, through to product technology, corporate social responsibility, sustainability. Judith was awarded an OBE in 2015 for services to farming and food industry, and she chairs and sits on a number of key government and charitable committees and boards. She's a member of the government's Food and Drink Sector Council and co-chairs the government's Agri-Food Tech Council. Now, as we face nationally and internationally a growing challenge to improve diets, nutrition, and health, I'm aware from my career that much research in this problem has been focused on the actions of government, of charitable organizations, and of civil society. And academics like me have had a particularly difficult time getting our head around understanding the critical role which industry plays as a driver of dietary improvement. graduates of the excellent IFSTAL program will have a broader vision than I do of this, and that's a very good thing, because we all need now to take a broader view of the partnerships that are going to be required for achieving the dietary change that this world needs. And so I can think of no one better to help us build that broader perspective, and particularly the role of industry, than our speaker tonight. So it's my great pleasure to invite Judith to present her lecture on collaboration for impact. Judith.
Let's see if this works. Brilliant, we're there. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Lauren, for a very welcoming introduction. And it really is my pleasure to be here. I don't know many of you, but the work that I do at Sainsbury's, for me, is particularly purposeful because we serve about 27 million customers a week. We source from over 70 countries around the world, and the way that we source those products does have a real impact. And in fact, the way we source our products has a bigger footprint than our own operations in this country. So I'm going to talk a lot about what we do with our value chain partners and some of the challenges that that brings to us. Challenges to the food system, which you will all be well aware of, so I won't spend too long talking about that. I do want to touch on what we call the cyclical versus the structural, because there is a bit of a disease of short-termism in the world, and we will only drive the kind of systemic change we need to see if we take a longer-term, more structural view. How do you build an enabling environment? And how are we approaching food systems thinking and what we call the connected business case? I am going to rattle through this at a rate of knots. So don't worry about notes or taking photographs or anything, because you can have this afterwards if you can download it, which Lauren knows all about. So our global food system is complex, and as you will all know, we've got some real challenges around 2050, how we're going to feed everybody on the planet, how we are going to do that with access to clean water, and all the things that you can see on that slide there. I think the key thing for me is that it is clear and obvious that more of the same is not going to be good enough. We are going to fundamentally have to change the way we go about feeding ourselves if we are to achieve those targets. And as you will also know, the way the world currently feeds itself in 2018 is not necessarily equitable, and there are big gaps in health and nutrition. We talk about the cyclical changes. Those are the things like the weather and extreme weather events, things like currency and markets and how they trade, and also in the way that governments and countries govern, place rules around food production and the way that food is traded globally. Those things happen all the time. They happen to us, and fundamentally, most of the time, we have no control over them whatsoever. But we do have control over what we would call the structural. And we talk a lot about cost efficiencies in our business because we're a commercial organisation. But cost efficiencies come when you use the world's precious resources wisely, and whether those resources are energy, water. The fact is, the more efficiently you use those things, the more cost efficient you are. The reason I say that's important, because if we don't deal with the structural, we will not be able to build resilience to those cyclical knocks that come our way, whether that's weather or whether that's currency markets. And if we don't build that resilience, we will not be able to look to the long term to create value. And by value, I mean value for everyone in the value chain. So we talk about the structural and the cyclical, and we talk about building resilience and creating value for everybody. Again, you'll probably have seen this, World Economic Forum, risks and impact of those risks. So likelihood on the horizontal axis and impact on the vertical axis. And the things that are in the top right-hand corner are the things you definitely don't want to happen. Unfortunately, those are the things that are happening. So things like extreme weather events, things like natural disasters. And in fact, last year, was a record year for insurance payouts for extreme weather events. So just under $140 billion was paid out for a lot of the things that you will have seen, like Beast from the East and so on. What really is interesting about this, though, is how it's changed over time. So if you go back to 2008, and we were to look at the top 5 risks in terms of likelihood and the top 5 risks in terms of impact, they were essentially economic, societal, and geopolitical. If you fast forward to 2018, they are predominantly environmental, some societal, and technological. So cybercrime and everything that goes with that, and our reliance on technology. So if you're an O2 user like me today, you've had quite an interesting day. I love this video because what this is showing is how average temperatures and the distribution of average temperatures has been changing over time. And the reason I show that is because we talk a lot about climate change and we talk about the fact of average temperature changes, but the issue isn't the average temperature change. The issue is the standard deviation around those averages. So basically, what is happening is that the standard deviation is moving at twice the rate of the average, which means that extreme weather events are now more likely. So what was a 1 in 700 years event is now a 1 in 10 years event, and we see the impact of that every day. The other thing about averages and the way it moves and the way that the climate is warming is that it's not linear. And whatever those systems are, at some point they reach a tipping point and then they go. And I show that because the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees may not sound much, but in terms of things like crop yields, in terms of things like rainfall, they are really, really significant. So significant that literally, if we want to keep to a 1.5 degree warming in our world, we've got 17 years left to do something about it before it does fall off that cliff. And that's important because actually keeping to 1.5 rather than 2 degrees will basically spare 10 million people from exposure to rising seas. And actually, if you look at what the Environment Agency are planning for, then they are planning in terms of flood risk and when do we need another Thames barrier to be built and where and how big. They are looking at 4 degrees of warming. So that's what they're looking at. And the Met Office last week came out with all of their predictions in terms of future climate, and basically, as we all know, and if you're a farmer in this country, you only know that too well, that summers will become hotter and drier and winters will become warmer and wetter, as we can evidence now. I think it's going to be 14 degrees at the weekend. A lot of all of that background has been forming new regulation, and that's important because good regulation is part of creating an enabling environment, and I'll talk a bit more about that towards the end, because if we do not have good regulation, we will drive the wrong behaviours, and there's some really good evidence of where that has happened in the last 10 to 15 years, and we don't want that again. And how does those separate bits of regulation all join up? Because we've got the agriculture bill, we've got the clean growth strategy, we've got the 25-year environment plan, and we're all eagerly awaiting the waste and resources strategy any minute now. All of those things need to work together to create the right environment. And when we're looking at this from our business perspective, we look at this to say, okay, well, there's new regulation coming and it's good regulation. Therefore, we will, when we're consulted on it, we will build on it rather than challenge it. But most of the time, we actually go beyond the legal minimum. We're not a legal minimum company. And that's for a number of reasons. One is sometimes it makes good sense to do some of the things that government want you to do. In other areas, the things that government want you to do aren't really helpful to our customers. And if anybody over a glass of wine wants to talk about food labelling, I can talk about that for hours, because that's one area where it truly isn't helpful to our customers, and we know that. But we look at the world in terms of legal minimum, industry average, and higher ground. And one of the things that I would say about all of this is that over the last 15 years, because there is a lot more collaboration, because there is a lot more coordinated activity around some of these grand challenges, that the industry average actually has moved in the right direction. Whether that's animal welfare, whether that is sustainable sourcing and some of the things that have happened in certification and deforestation and reporting, whether that's ethical sourcing and things like the Modern Slavery Act. There has been a general move to improve those standards by businesses, government, and indeed the people's vote, working to move these things onto the greater good. So, in the context of that, global trade, it is a busy world and it is getting busier. So at a global level or even closer to home, I thought it was remarkable. We're spending a lot of time talking about Brexit at the moment, but the fact that 11,000 vehicles are crossing Dover-Calais every week, full of food and drink, seemed to be a bit of surprise to people, when actually this information is all readily available. And if you look at what is happening in terms of global trade, it has never been busier. A lot of that driven by South America, a lot of that driven by China and the Far East. But 26% of all global trade now is in agricultural and food products. And if you look at that, in the last 10 years, that number has trebled, which is, I mean, that really is exponential growth. So massive, massive changes in things that are literally moving around the world constantly as we speak. About 36 days of food, and most of it is on the water somewhere moving around. So if that's the background to some of those cyclical things that are beyond our control, what are the food system things that are within our control if we were to think about doing them differently? And the first example I want to use is some work that we're doing bringing the beef and dairy supply chains together for a number of reasons. First of all, they are very needy systems in terms of using the planet's resources. And actually, because they work in splendid isolation most of the time, all of the synergies and all the benefits that could come from bringing those systems together, along with the arable system, are lost. And they fall between the gaps of basically the food system working, no pun intended, in silos. So using the progeny of the dairy chain to feed the beef chain, rather than looking at bull calves that are no use to a dairy herd, and then thinking about how that works with arable to provide crop rotations that actually help with black grass management, which is a huge problem in terms of efficiency, and thinking about how we can create that virtuous dairy and beef, what we call integrated beef value chain, we know that we can reduce the footprint by up to 50%, which means you either need half the land or you can produce twice as much red meat. Not for me to say which one is right, but it does mean that we can find much more efficient ways of producing dairy and meat products if we would want to. And not only can we find those efficiencies, we can also create value. So the use of technology now in those food systems to understand how to use sensors to pick up things like lameness and mastitis in the dairy herd, or indeed to understand when an animal is entering estrus, where you've got 8 hours basically for that animal to basically be inseminated and create basically another cycle. Those things are all perfectly possible in today's world, and the technology is very cost effective, it is very accessible, and it has a payback of about 18 months. The problem we have, unlike other sectors, is that particularly the beef sector is hugely fragmented, and therefore getting any kind of concerted effort across that, when the average beef farmer in the UK produces beef as a sideline and produces 30 head of animals a year, is really difficult. So there's lots of challenges, but we know it can be done. And we can also put a value to those things so that when we're looking at our value chain partners, we can show them the value to them of perhaps investing in some of those things for a more cost-effective business. So beef and dairy, a good example. The one that I probably have most affection for is the work that we're doing in fish, because this is really complicated. And it's really complicated because most of it goes on out of the sight of anybody. And we have to find more ingenious ways of thinking about what's going on. So we live in a planet that is 69% salt water. Fresh water and dry land make up the rest, as you can see. And managing those oceans is really, really difficult. And we've been doing a lot of work in this area because we have an ambition to be the retailer that sells the most sustainable fish. And when we made that commitment in 2010, we didn't quite realise how difficult it would be. Anyway, why is that important? So what this graph basically shows is, goes back to 1950, forward to today, and looks at the increase in consumption per capita of fish, which has been steadily increasing to 21 kilos. And that's not 21 kilos of prepared fish, that's the fish weights that you have to catch to produce filleted and gutted, etc., etc. The growth in most of that has come from aquaculture, not from the wild capture fisheries, which is important. It also has meant that fish plays a more important role in providing nutrition at a global level. And indeed, fish, poultry and chicken. And poultry and chicken, because those two food systems have been focused on, have become very efficient, very cost effective, a bit like aquaculture is now, and can provide very affordable sources of protein. Total cost is a different thing, but from a consumer point of view, that's driven the growth in those proteins. And fish is great, actually, from a nutritional security point of view. So particularly things like omega-3 long-chain fatty acids, essential. They are essential for human health, and lots of issues around mental health, cognitive health, macular degeneration from people who just don't get enough of those nutrients in their diet. There is a recommendation that came years ago from the Food Standards Agency that recommends 2 portions of fish a week. One must be oily. That means that the 21 kilos that gets caught per capita has to be 32 kilos per capita, which means that we have got a shortfall of about 600,000 tonnes of fish a year in this country. So it doesn't quite add up when you look at what is happening in terms of this picture of aquaculture versus wild caught, because this is not an accurate picture. This is based on what is reported, and what is reported is basically 75% of what is actually caught, because the estimates are that 25% of the world's fish is caught illegally, unregulated and unreported. And because it's unreported, we don't know what it is. So what fish, and because it's unregulated, we don't know about the management of those fisheries. And a lot of fisheries are either not managed at all or poorly managed. And in fact, only 10% of the world's fisheries are certified as sustainable by the Marine Stewardship Council. So we've got a problem. So one of the things we've been working on with a bit of technology is a thing called Ocean Mind. An ocean mind is basically saying, how can we see what's going on in the middle of an ocean 5,000 miles away, particularly those oceans where there are no fisheries improvements programs and where there is no regulation and where we know there are large levels of illegal and unreported fishing. So it's going to think about it. While it's thinking about it, we've been working with the satellite catapult at Harwell to basically look at satellite imagery and vessel monitoring GPS systems. So the government has access to vessel monitoring. but it doesn't share it. It's not open. It's not available to the public. So we can't look at where the fishing boats that in theory we've bought our fish from are actually fishing. We have to do that ourselves. So the satellite catapult at Harwell do that for us. So they create, and when the map and the globe finally comes up, it will show you all these little dots, which are all vessels. We can then clash that database with the database of where those vessels are logged, who they're owned by, whether they've had any previous warnings. So they'll have a yellow card, a red card, and if they're really, really naughty, they get a black card. We know if they've had warnings. We know what they've got quotas for, and quotas are quite complicated because they are time-bound. You can only catch that fish at certain times of the year. They're species-bound, and they are geographically bound. So if you are in the wrong fishery and you're fishing with the wrong, and the fishing method and fishing in the wrong way and really shouldn't be there, we can now see that, which means when they present us with their Marine Stewardship Council certificate that says, I caught Atlantic cod on this day in this region, we can say, yes, you did, or no, you didn't. And that is a first. We've worked with the catapult to do that, and I'm going to give up on this slide in a minute. And it is now set up Ocean Mind as a not-for-profit organisation. So anyone can use that system to verify where their fish and how their fish has been caught. So I will leave that. The reason I was going to show you that, not just because it's amazing satellite stuff, but because it's typical of how we're now using technology to manage complex food systems, or in fact complex anything. And we are layering all these different technologies in different combinations with different applications to understand our value chains better. And, you know, you'll hear a lot of talk about blockchain being used for traceability, transparency, and disclosure. That's probably overhyped, but there are different types of technologies like embedded barcodes, RFID tagging, and again, tracking things through very accessible satellite applications that mean we have a better chance now of knowing where our food is coming from and how it's sourced than ever before. Going back to fish, one of the challenges then for us is to say, if that is not an accurate picture because of all of the reasons that I have just told you, how on earth have we got a chance of managing it successfully? Because what we know is obviously when we're farming fish, we know exactly what the inputs are, we know exactly what we're taking out, and we can measure that and we can report that. But with wild capture, what is the rest of that 25% made up of? And we have a couple of theories on that. That 25% is made up of things that shouldn't be there because the fishing gear is not selective. So you will know these great big perseining nets that don't just catch tuna, but they catch sharks, they catch dolphins, they catch turtles and everything else. You'll know that fish aggregating devices, which we can also locate with our satellite application, are bad news for aggregating those species. So what are we going to do about that? So this is another bit, and I'm hoping this video is going to work because otherwise it's really difficult to explain. But basically what happens with a fishing vessel, this is a trawler, so it's trawling fish, has very, very non-selective fishing gear. And you will get in there two things: fish that are immature, and you're therefore taking them out of the growth and breeding cycle, which means the sustainable biomass of that fishery cannot be maintained. And you will be basically catching fish that you don't have a quota for, which you have to discard. And we have no idea of the size and scale of that discard, and we probably never will. However, there's some work that's going on which I think is quite interesting with the University of Aberdeen and Fisheries Innovation Scotland, where we're using cameras as the fish are coming through the net to see what's coming through the net, then using digital imaging and artificial intelligence to look at that, and then discarding fish that are immature, too immature to be caught, because there are rules around that. You can't catch fish that are less than a certain size, or species that you don't have a quota for. and they are released alive, so they go back into the fishery. These are the kind of technologies that really are going to be the game changers in the future, and that's happening today. So we're trialling that. I'm not confident that it is working perfectly, but you have to try these things. But I can tell you more if anyone's interested. The other piece is, and you will know, there are lots and lots of challenges around fish farming. Aquaculture is a very, very new industry. It's only 50 years old, and there's been lots of mistakes. There are lots of challenges around it, environmental, ethical, all sorts of things. But the biggest thing is how you get really efficient feed conversion rates. And there is no point farming fish if you're using fish and you're fishing that fish unsustainably in order to feed salmon or sea bass. So doing a lot of work on feed ingredient innovation and going right back down the food chain, because they are the most efficient converters. And if you're looking for protein sources, everything from algae up is the kind of things that are being looked at. And again, this is happening today. So fish, in terms of the next thing I wanted to talk about, because it's very topical, is food waste. At least if on a global scale, 20%, at least 20% of all food that is produced is wasted. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's fish or seafood, dairy, meat, there isn't a value chain that isn't impacted. And if you look at where in the value chain that food is lost, it varies by country. So in developing countries tends to be very much at post-harvest, pre-consumer, for lots of reasons around infrastructure, transport, and the fact that many of these countries don't have food processing infrastructure. And of course, the great thing about food processing is that it enables you to store food, whether you freeze it, whether you juice it, whether you can it, whether you dry it or you pickle it. And all of those things are there to preserve food for longer. And many of these countries simply don't have that food processing infrastructure. But the point being is we've now got a very clear view of what is being wasted. And if you think of going back to the challenges on the first slide about how many people we're going to have to feed, almost half the problem would be solved if we didn't waste this food. And the food was in the right place at the right time, and it was safe and healthy and nutritious. So much of our food waste, it actually is, the good news, is avoidable. So if you look at this is the UK now rather than the globe, but if you look at the UK and various food groups, we know exactly where the challenges are, and we know exactly where in the value chain they are. And interestingly, we did a lot of work on consumer food waste, because the average family wastes about £485 of food a year. This is perfectly good food that they just don't eat and they throw out. But actually, the biggest opportunity is upstream in the agricultural part of the value chain. So we've been doing some work on what we've been calling intelligent supply and demand. And intelligent supply and demand basically says we've got loads of data around crop yields, around what happens when the summer is wet and hot, or what happens when the summer is dry and hot. We have loads of information about what customers do when the weather changes, and about 15 years worth of data. And then we've been playing around with some clever people at Microsoft, looking at how we can clash those databases and understand how we better match supply and demand. And a bit later, I'm going to talk about something else that will help this challenge. But the more that we can manage this and the more that we can forecast it, the better we will be at making sure that food that is perfectly good either never makes it from the field because it's just not worth harvesting it, or gets lost somewhere in transit, which is even worse because all of the energy and effort that's gone into getting it to that point. So I think this is one of the things that's going to be one of the biggest game changers. All of that is happening at both the global level and at a very local level. So the Consumer Goods Forum, don't know if you know it, it's 430 odd members. There's everything from all the big multinationals like Nestle, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, all of the big retailers globally, a lot of the traders, people like Cargill, people like Olam, and indeed farming groups, working together to try and create a better way of doing things. And the Consumer Goods Forum are part of the Sustainable Development Goal 12.3, which is known as Champions 12.3. So at a global level, that is working. In the UK, the Institute of Grocery Distribution and WRAP have basically a food waste roadmap, which says that we're going to halve the amount of value chain waste by 2030. That's the bit upstream that I've just talked about. And business in the community have got a piece at a very local level talking about how can you turn waste into wealth. So it's not just avoiding that waste, but where you do have waste that will be unavoidable, then that is going into a more circular economy where it can create value. The big enabler of this, and come back again to an enabling environment, is food waste reporting. And we get asked all the time, you know, you should report on your food waste. And I say, yes, we do actually. But it's not just good enough to say I report on it. You have to report to a standard. And that's why at a global level, the World Resources Institute, the Consumer Goods Forum, various other people got together and using existing ISO standards, but new ISO standards, created both a protocol and a reporting and accounting standard, which is focused on definitions of materials, their destination, and we now adopt that reporting protocol. To be fair to say that it is both complicated, because it is complicated, which is why you need a standard to report on it, but it's also really insightful. And until everybody reports to a standard and works together and collaborates, we won't make the progress we need to make, but we are there and we're on the journey. Another favourite topic, palm oil, always in the news. This is a classic one that is, whose lens do you want to look at when you're looking at palm oil? Sorry about the murky slide, but this is basically saying where palm oil is produced in the world. Basically, it's around the tropics, so it's where all the rainforests are. But it is a huge crop, and it's actually really important. And if you look over the last 40 years, palm oil has come from nowhere in the world ranking of edible oils to being number one, followed by soya oil. So phenomenal rise, and of course all the negative things that go with that. It's really efficient from a land use point of view. WWF quotes the figure that you would need 9 times as much land to produce the same amount of oil if you took palm oil out of the system. Those numbers vary, but it's huge. It's not at the margins, it is huge. It also employs a lot of people, and 2 countries, Indonesia and Malaysia, account for 85% of the world's production, which is phenomenal. But the challenges of destroying rainforests to plant palm have been very well and quite rightly exposed. So biodiversity, orangutans, and you know all of that. But actually, the point about it being an efficient crop is not just about its very high yielding, but it is efficient in the way that it converts energy. So again, you may have something that's high yielding, but if it's not efficient in the way it produces that yield, then that's not very helpful. But in fact, Kew Gardens, the scientists at Kew, produce a thing called the State of the World's Plants. And 2 years ago, they did a piece that launched with that talked about the 7 plants that would save the world in the case of catastrophe. And basically palm was one of them. The other thing about palm, thank you, 5 minutes, is that it is not great from a nutrition point of view, high in saturated fat, only coconut oil and palm kernel oil are higher in saturated fat, but that makes it good at other things like cosmetics, candles, various other bits and pieces. And then the only bit about sustainable palm oil that I would say is when people tell you what's sustainable palm oil, is, or say they're using sustainable palm oil, it could be a number of things. It could be certified, it could be mass balance, it could be segregated, or they could actually just be buying green palm certificates. So I put this in there because the devil is in the detail. But we have over 2,500 products that contain palm oil, and we have great compliance using proper sustainable palm oil. And that includes derivatives. Food, diets, nutrition and health, you know this. Obesity on one hand going up, and on the other hand, billions of people in the world going to bed every night hungry and malnourished. And it's not just about calories, it's about the quality of those calories. So essentially the population with adequate nutrients is not good enough, and the nutrient quality of some foods has declined. The reason because that is that in a lot of instances soil health has declined. So in terms of this, soil health, plant health, animal health, human health, all inextricably linked. And if we forget that, we're all pretty doomed. So we've been looking at something that we're calling making every calorie count, which we think is far more positive than talking about all the things that you need to eat less of. We actually are eating less calories, but we are getting larger. So the fact that we're eating less calories means those calories have to work harder for us. And they have to work harder, particularly in areas where we know we've got deficiencies. Harvest Plus is working at a global level with people like DFID in this country, the Gates Foundation. This isn't genetic modification, but this is just saying pick the right varieties, breed the right varieties, look after the soil, and you can produce crops that are very, very nutritious. And by 2030, the view is that 1 billion people in developing countries will be eating these biofortified crops. But it's also a challenge at home because people are eating different things. They are changing their diets rapidly. I don't need to tell you all about what's happening from a vegan and vegetarian point of view, but there are some challenges around that in terms of the nutrient quality of the foods that they're eating. And that is an opportunity not only to make sure that people do get the right nutrients, but also an innovation opportunity. So a couple of weeks ago, we launched super mushrooms. They're grown on a special substrate that means that they are rich in vitamin B12, which is what vegans and vegetarians miss because B12 only occurs in animal products. We treat them also with ultraviolet light, and we do that because it increases the vitamin D content, and 25% of the population are deficient in vitamin D, and you'll have heard the reports about artificial fortification and supplements aren't as good as the natural food. And that is farmed in a really efficient system in Ireland. Monaghan mushrooms, state of the art. And I would say that because the whole opportunity for vertical farming is huge. For a lot of reasons. First of all, disconnects land ownership and the quality of the land from food production, but enables you to grow in a controlled environment where the impact of extreme weather isn't quite what it is. On plastics, all I would say is it is complicated. This is what we use. Only 16% of plastics are recycled in the UK. As you know, a lot of those plastics were exported. China made the ban last year. Malaysia are about to make the ban. A lot of plastics now going to Poland. Poland's setting itself up as the recycling centre of Europe. But the reality is we need to be recycling this plastic at home. And government should, in the waste and resources strategy, tell us how, through tax and levies, they are going to raise the monies to build the infrastructure that means you can recycle at home. We've signed up to everything. Again, a global plastics task force. We're working on a reporting protocol so that we can report to a standard. We are signed up to support the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in terms of driving the circular economy and the UK Plastics Pact. The reason I show the Plastics Pact is that and pact, those numbers, if done in that way, will create a circular economy. So if 100% is reusable, recyclable or compostable, 70% is recycled effectively, all packaging has 30% of recycled content, then you can create a circular economy. And that's what we're all aiming for by 2025. All of that is the connected business case. So how's the system working? where is the impact of that system, and what's the full business value of that system? And that is hard work. Our finance team at Sainsbury's really don't like it because they have to understand the true cost of the things that we're doing and the true cost of the system. And again, I can talk about that for ages. But if we want to drive the kind of systemic change, we need to build this enabling environment, which means all of things that I've touched upon, whether it's a science-ready sector for vertical farms or whizzy fishing techniques, we have to invest in those things. The EU is still important, and particularly if you start to talk about fisheries management, we have to have the great data to be able to do that, and so on and so forth. So without that enabling environment, it is very difficult to drive the kind of systemic change you want to see. We have to go beyond regulation, because regulation stops us doing the bad stuff, but it doesn't deliver net positive, and it certainly won't deliver the kind of things that we need to see, whether that's climate change. But that only happens, all of that, if every stakeholder in the system can see the value for them or the value for the greater system. And most of the time, we only look at the value we create for ourselves. We don't look at the value we can create for others in that. So if we don't achieve this and we aren't able to look at it through every stakeholder's lens, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word stakeholders, then we will never deliver something that is sustainable in the long term. We've got a common language and currency to be able to do that with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we need to use them. And some of the metrics, i.e. the currency of the Sustainable Development Goals, isn't good enough. And we need to do it collectively at a global level, a national level, a local level, and indeed an individual level, because we all can, as individuals, make a difference. That will all be driven, I say, by individuals and organisations that understand all of those things. But I want to leave you with one thought, and that is the one thing I've discovered in it's more than 35 years now of doing this, is that what you believe to be true today will not be true in 5 years' time. So our job is, whatever we're doing, whoever we're working with, and wherever I might be advising our board and making recommendations for what we should be doing, I am looking to provide them with the best truth. But I have to tell them that this is science that's rapidly evolving, the data that is rapidly evolving. 90% of the data in the world was basically created in the last 2 years, and that's only going to grow exponentially. What we know to be true today may not be true tomorrow, and that's really difficult for people looking for the absolute truth. So thank you for listening. I've gone on far too long, but Lauren's been very kind. She's been waving the 5-minute finish around for the last 15. Thank you very much.
So thanks for joining us, and I hope you have a good discussion afterwards. And now let's bring our discussion here to a start. I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to suppress mine because there were so many interesting topics that you raised and so many interesting perspectives and statistics. Let me invite some comments and questions from the audience. I'll take a few, probably, give you a bit of a choice. Is that okay? You want to go first? Alan. There's a roving mic.
Thanks very much for a fantastic talk. My name's Alan Dangor. I'm head of nutrition at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I wanted to ask you about one of the issues you brought up at the beginning, which was really focused on extreme weather events, changing environments, changing planetary health, I suppose. Do you feel that the food industry is working together to enable the food system to ensure adequate and safe foods for populations around the world?
I think it varies tremendously by, can you hear me? Yeah. Varies tremendously by country and by category. So some areas have made what we would have historically called progress. We now know that that wasn't necessarily the progress that we wanted to see, and there were unintended consequences of those things. But because of the nature of what they've done, historically, they are able to react quite quickly. So I think poultry industry is a really good example of that, where huge amount of investment to drive things like caged eggs, broiler house production, that, you know, people sort of gave themselves a good pat on the back for being able to produce a chicken in 39 days. But the other downsides of that have been not necessarily great. So if I think, for example, about something like antimicrobial resistance, but because that sector is very finely tuned and very cohesive, when they've put their mind to dealing with that challenge, and the same with something like Campylobacter, when the Food Standards Agency created ACT, which was acting on Campylobacter together for the sector and facilitated that, the reduction in Campylobacter incidence and the reduction in antibiotic use in the poultry sector has gone down dramatically. So those things can be sorted because of the nature of that value chain. But I think there are lots of things that we've created, and whether it's the food safety aspects or the antimicrobial resistance aspects, they're difficult. I mean, plastics is a great one. We all signed up to the Courtauld commitment, which was there was too much packaging waste. The metric that was for the Courtauld commitment back in the early 2000s was packaging weight. So the tax was based on the weight of packaging. So the easiest way to reduce your tax burden, whether you're a retailer, a manufacturer or a packaging supplier, because you pay your bit of the tax, would be to make your packaging lighter. And the easiest way to make your packaging lighter is to make it plastic. So move out of glass, move out of tin, move out of heavy cardboard. So the move into plastic was actually encouraged by a tax system and targets to reduce the weight of packaging. We now know that wasn't really a sensible thing. So hence the PRN tax system, the plastics levy, all the things that we're waiting for in the waste and resources strategy will try and rectify that. And that wasn't because businesses were doing bad things. They were incentivised and thought actually we were doing the right thing. But hindsight's wonderful, which is why this best truth is so important. Sorry, rattling on a bit.
A question up there, and I'll take maybe 2 or 3 now, and then we can.
Thank you. Thank you for that talk. Do you have specific frameworks?
Sorry,
All good,
I wasn't listening. I put it on mute, stupidly.
Have you developed specific frameworks for systems thinking in such a big, complex system? Or do you use thinking models that already exist?
Let's take a couple more.
Okay.
Just one down here on the.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and sharing a really, really insightful talk. My name's Nathan. I'm studying globalization development here at SOAS. I'm curious to hear a little bit of the crossover between some of the points that you raised when it came to innovation across the food systems, and then also with some of the countries which are providing inputs which are in a developing context, so Indonesia and Malaysia, which you mentioned. Whether or not you have any experience or insight across the food systems where food suppliers or larger corporations are actually able to share some of their innovation back into these developing countries and share the value across those stakeholders.
Okay, let's just take those two. So systems thinking and sharing innovation.
Yeah. Be fair to say that as a business, we are at the beginning of that journey of systems thinking. And in fact, we are just rewriting, we have our sustainability strategy goes to 2020, and we're just rewriting it for 2030, which we will publish next year. And that is all about systems thinking. So it's work in progress. So I'd love to talk to you if you've got some thoughts on that. Because I think the things that we're looking at that will underpin that future are a systems thinking approach, understanding multiple impacts, where we can have a net positive effect, and how do we drive transformative change. It's that systemic change that I talked about. So those are our priorities, because we know that if we don't do that, the system will break, because it's just not sustainable and it won't achieve what it needs to achieve. In terms of developing countries and I suppose that sharing of that technology, I am always amazed at how receptive those communities are to doing things differently. So if I look at some of the most amazing innovations in the supply chain, a lot of them are in developing countries, because they do not have all of the historical baggage and legacy that we have in the UK. So our big Achilles heel is the fact that we've got ancient food systems that have been grossly underinvested in for years. So I think in the last 15 years, UK food processing and manufacturing has been, of the developed countries, from a capex investment point of view, in the bottom 25% of countries every year. And you only have to go abroad and look at things like state-of-the-art anaerobic digestion and what they're really doing to get value back out of waste. Looking at what they're doing because they have to and needs must on things like irrigation. Things like sensor technology where, again, because of the conditions that they're growing in, I've got very sensitive technologies around not just, whether you have trickle feed irrigation or whether you have, great rotary sprayers, but this is about measuring the swelling through sensors on the trunk of a citrus tree and just saying, well, actually, we should be irrigating now according to our plan, but we don't need to. And some of the things that we've done using those kind of technologies is to, we've got a program called More Crop Per Drop, is basically reduce enormously the amount of water that is needed on some of those crops in water vulnerable areas. So yeah, there are quite a few examples, and I can probably give you some more, but a lot of the agri-tech investments in this country now are being exported, and the uptake is greater overseas than it is in the UK, which I think is quite sad, really. Yeah.
Thanks. Some more questions. Gosh, lots of them around. Yes, go there first.
Hi, again, thank you for the talk. It was most enlightening in lots of ways.
You didn't see my best video.
Look forward to it online. You said about global warming being between 1.5 and 2 degrees. There's a lot of stuff around at the moment saying that we've got 12 years, not 18 years to get that right. And also that it's probably going to burst through that no matter what we do. Is your food systems planning, like the environment, going for 4 degrees, or is it stuck at between 1.5 and 2?
I think, oh, sorry, I'm not allowed to answer that yet.
No, not yet. Take one from the middle here, and then we'll take one from the, right there, thanks. Yep.
Thank you so
Okay, you there. One, we'll take 3, so please proceed,
Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Juliet Tempest, and I'm studying here at SOAS in the Masters of Anthropology of Food program. And I'm from the US, where food access is a large part of the conversation about food systems. And in your talk, you spoke quite eloquently about issues in the food system related to sustainability. So I was curious to hear in the UK to what extent are conversations about food access occurring, and then what do you see the role of, what do you see as the role of industry within those conversations?
Okay, thank you. And one more, please.
Yeah, thank you. So you spoke towards the end about, first of all, how within the Sainsbury's finance team, often it's hard to convince them of, or to engage with them on incorporating the total value, the total cost of a product. And you talked about also how one must convince all stakeholders to sort of understand the greater value they're producing. And so my question is, when it comes to these questions around
the fact that a lot of stakeholders do operate according to the bottom line, according to this profit motive. How have you found ways to, I guess, change incentive structures so that these solutions are scalable?
Okay, great. So your targets, your degree targets for your food planning, food access and incentivizing.
Yeah. So on the planning piece, I think what we have is a sort of absolute approach to saying what is the very best that we can do. So on some things we set targets. We haven't set ourselves a target for global warming. What we have said is we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and we're moving all our refrigeration to non-fluorocarbons. Or we are working on our integrated beef project because we know we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in beef production by 50% if we slaughter an animal at 17 months rather than the average in the UK at the moment, which is 27 months, which has all sorts of implications on feed, on, greenhouse gas emissions as a consequence of that. We're working on the things that I talked about on fish feed because we know that what is happening in aquaculture feed at the moment is, again, not sustainable. So we don't set targets, I'd say, from a global temperature point of view, but everything that we try to do to the optimum, as in our very best. I think, if I think about our business, about 50% of it is in our own brand, which is around 12,500 products sourced from all over the world. And as I said, the impact we have is huge. Our challenge is to understand where we can have a most material impact, and it isn't always in the things that you think that you're going to have that are at scale and are easy to deliver. They're actually the things that you can't see. So a lot of our time at the moment is being spent mapping that out, because whilst we have a level of traceability, so we can trace things back, we don't necessarily have real-time transparency, which we need to be able to do those things, which is why the technology is so important. But interestingly, one of the biggest pieces of regulation that has driven that has been the Modern Slavery Act, because what the Modern Slavery Act says is you have to understand your value chains, and you, as the retailer or the end business, are responsible for everyone in that value chain, and which is unheard of and unprecedented, which actually provided us with a problem for 2 years while we mapped all of that out. The other thing it says is that you're also responsible for the brands that you sell. So the other 50% of our business that we don't produce and that we don't own, but is Mars, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, Reckitt Benckiser, so on and so forth. We are responsible for them as well. So we are having very different conversations with branded manufacturers and find ourselves working with people that we would normally be arguing over the price of a Mars bar with, that we're actually working with them on what are we going to do about deforestation and cocoa, because actually, whilst we've all signed up to zero net deforestation in 2016, we actually deforested more land than ever before, which can't be right. So again, it's not a precise answer, but I truly believe people are working harder than ever on those things. I've forgotten the next question.
Food access.
Oh gosh, yeah, right. I think it's food access to healthy, safe, nutritious, affordable food and the inequalities that drives is one of the biggest challenges. And I don't have all the answers, because a lot of it is around local authority planning, it is about education, it's multi-factorial. But we are part of a project with the Consumer Goods Forum in the UK, which is called Collaboration for Healthier Living. And that collaboration is working with the Guy's and St Thomas's Trust, that basically has got a 5-year, £20 million plan to look at the entire ecosystem around access to, safe healthy, fresh, tasty, nutritious food, in Southwark and Lambeth, because Southwark and Lambeth, on any measure that you care to look at, whether it's obesity, whether it is educational attainment, whether it is employment, whether it is social mobility, is in the top 10 boroughs in the country, but top 10 for all the wrong reasons. And they have unbelievable challenges in those boroughs. So we've got a 5-year project that we're working on with the idea of understanding with multiple interventions that are data-driven, and we can do that because we've got access to all sorts of kinds of data, multiple interventions trying to create a what works framework. So the idea being that out of all of these things that you could possibly do, which ones are absolutely vital, which ones are more discretionary, but in what order do they have to come, and how do you put it all together? And they've already produced the first report called Bite Size, and it actually talks about how that approach will work. I think that's probably one of the most comprehensive and exciting projects that we've been part of to address that absolute problem, because it's the nub of it, and there's so many reasons for it. Yeah.
So your next answer will have to be our last one, but I hope we'll have a chance to ask you some more questions. And that was about really how you convinced the finance team to accept the externalities, I guess, in the business model. Yeah.
I think and this is sort of sounds really trite, but you have to show them the money, and money in the broadest sense of the word value. So we've worked since 2006 with Accounting for Sustainability on integrated reporting, natural capital reporting, social capital reporting. It's complicated. At the moment, those accounting mechanisms are not widely adopted, A, because they're not a regulatory requirement, and B, because they're not simple. And if you look at the regulatory burden in the world of finance, it is huge. So I think we have to find much smarter, cleverer ways of engaging the finance community. And I think some of the work that Accounting for Sustainability are doing now is absolutely addressing that. So they've got a series of essential how-to guides that you can download on, how to do natural capital made easy. And it's not that easy. But I think there are some things that are coming. So for example, the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, so TCFD, that was put out in the Environment Bill as best practice that potentially could be regulated for. So it would become a requirement for you to disclose those risks to your business, from whether that's the flood risk in the UK or the supply chain risk from floods in Spain, which are all very real and they have a material impact, and you can measure that quite easily. That at one end. Two, at the other end, for the first time ever, the questions that we are now being asked by investors around this, for the very real reason of that first slide that said, last year the biggest ever insurance claims for climate-related extreme weather events is real and material, and they want to know that we're dealing with those things. So I think there's a regulatory piece that will need to come in some shape or form. So natural capital reporting will come, but there is also the financial community in all shapes and forms, and particularly investors who are asking questions, and intelligent sort of probing questions, not just the sort of Dow Jones Sustainability Index and all the things that we know, but really probing those things. And I think that will be the driving force.
Yeah, Judith, thank you so much. It's one thing that struck me is, we all have our issues about food and food industry. But when we sat down tonight to hear what you had to say, and then to hear the answers you given to our questions, I think I came to realize how many issues you have to deal with at once in this situation. so many different aspects that have to come with brand advocacy. So, and thank you for providing us really great answers for a lot of questions. Sorry for rushing you through so many questions. I hope you'll join us for
Oh,
a few minutes.
definitely, yeah.
Great. So prepare your other cue starts out there. And I'd just like to thank you again for an excellent talk and a great introduction to some of the challenges that private sector faces in being sustainable and meeting all these demands. Thank you.
No, thank you for inviting me. Thank you.